The cold wind whipped across the Montana territory as Willow Shaw clutched her wailing infant tighter to her breast, her tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. The sunrise painted the small churchyard in hues of gold and crimson, making the fresh grave before her seem all the more stark and terrible in its finality. Little Thomas wouldn't stop crying, as though he too understood that his father would never again rock him to sleep. Willow had been standing there since before dawn, unable to leave the wooden cross-marking where they had laid her husband to rest just yesterday. 3 months of marriage, that's all they had had before the fever took him. "Madam," a deep voice called from behind her, "you shouldn't be out here in this cold with a little one." Willow turned, her red-rimmed eyes meeting those of a stranger. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat atop a dappled gray horse, his face partially hidden beneath a well-worn hat. A cowboy, judging by his attire, and the cattle brand visible on his saddlebag. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice cracking as Thomas's cries grew louder. The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing a kind face weathered by sun and wind. He couldn't have been more than 30, with eyes the color of a summer storm. "Name's Garrett Blackwell," he said, approaching carefully. "I was passing through when I heard the crying." He nodded toward the baby. "Sounds like he's having a rough morning, same as his mama." Willow nodded, trying to soothe Thomas by rocking him, but her arms were tired, and her heart was too heavy to put much effort into it. "Her baby cried in the churchyard at dawn," Garrett said softly, almost to himself. Then, with genuine compassion in his eyes, he added, "Let me hold him a while, madam. You look like you could use a moment's rest." Something in his gentle tone broke through her grief-hardened defenses. Hesitantly, Willow passed her son to the stranger's waiting arms, Montana Territory, 1876. A place where life was harsh and death was common, but kindness was remembered. "I'm Willow," she said, "Willow Shaw, and this is Thomas." Garrett nodded, cradling the infant with surprising ease. Almost immediately, Thomas's wails softened to whimpers, then ceased entirely as he stared up at the strange new face above him. "Well, would you look at that?" Garrett said with a small smile. "Seems he just needed a change of scenery." "Or perhaps he's simply too stunned by your beard to remember he's upset," Willow replied, surprising herself with the hint of humor in her voice. It was the first time she'd felt anything but grief since John had taken ill. "My beard has been known to render folks speechless," Garrett replied with a gentle wink, "though usually it's because they're wondering when I last washed it." A ghost of a smile touched Willow's lips, vanishing almost as quickly as it appeared. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell." "Garrett, please," he corrected. "And it's no trouble. I've got 6 younger siblings back home in Kansas, spent half my childhood with a baby in my arms." The wind picked up, and Willow shivered violently. Her black morning dress offered little protection against the Montana spring chill. "You should get this little one inside," Garrett said, his tone shifting to concern. "It's too cold for him out here." "We were just leaving," Willow lied, knowing full well she'd been standing there for hours with no intention of moving. Garrett studied her face for a long moment, then glanced at the fresh grave. "Your husband?" Willow nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in her throat. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Shaw," he said, genuine sympathy in his voice. "When did it happen?" "Yesterday," she whispered. "The fever took him fast. 3 days from first symptoms to—" She couldn't finish, gesturing helplessly at the grave instead. Garrett's expression darkened. "You shouldn't be alone right now. Is there someone looking after you? Family nearby?" Willow shook her head. "We came west 6 months ago. John had dreams of starting a ranch." She looked toward the horizon, toward their small homestead 3 miles outside of town. "I have the place to myself now, just me and Thomas." Garrett's gaze followed hers. "A homestead's no place for a woman alone with a baby." "I don't have much choice," Willow replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. "It's all we have left." Garrett nodded, respecting her determination despite his concern. He glanced down at Thomas, who had fallen asleep in his arms, tiny fingers curled around one of Garrett's large ones. "At least let me see you safely home," he offered. "My horse can carry us both, and it'll be faster than walking." Willow hesitated. She'd been raised to be cautious around strangers, especially men. But there was something trustworthy in Garrett's eyes, and the thought of the long walk home with Thomas in the cold made her decision easier. "Thank you," she said simply. Garrett handed Thomas back to her and helped them both onto his horse before swinging up behind them. Willow sat sideways in front of him, the baby cradled between them. "Hold on," he said, his arms creating a protective circle around her and Thomas as he took the reins. As they rode away from the churchyard, Willow found herself leaning slightly into the warmth of the stranger at her back. It was the first time since John's passing that she didn't feel completely alone. The homestead came into view after a short ride, a simple cabin with a small stable beside it. Smoke curled from the chimney, surprising Willow. "I didn't leave a fire burning," she said with alarm. "Someone's there," Garrett noted, his body tensing protectively as his right hand moved toward the revolver at his hip. As they approached, the cabin door opened and an elderly woman stepped out, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Mrs. Miller," Willow called out in relief. "There you are, child," the woman replied, hurrying toward them as Garrett helped Willow dismount. "I've been worried sick when I came to check on you and found the cabin empty." "I'm sorry," Willow said. "I needed to. I had to see him one more time." Mrs. Miller's weathered face softened with understanding. "Of course you did, dear. And who's this?" she asked, eyeing Garrett with undisguised suspicion. "Garrett Blackwell, madam," he answered, tipping his hat respectfully. "I was passing the churchyard and offered Mrs. Shaw a ride home." "Well, Mr. Blackwell, that was mighty kind of you," Mrs. Miller said, though her tone suggested she was reserving judgment. "Now, Willow, let's get you and little Thomas inside. I've made some breakfast, though I suspect you won't have much appetite." Willow turned to Garrett. "Thank you again for your help." He nodded, his eyes lingering on her face a moment longer than necessary. "It was no trouble, Mrs. Shaw." "Where are you headed?" Mrs. Miller asked, her arm around Willow's shoulders. "Nowhere in particular," Garrett admitted. "I've been working my way north, looking for ranch work. Thought I might try my luck in Helena." Mrs. Miller and Willow exchanged a glance. "You know," Willow said hesitantly, "my husband had started building up a small herd. Nothing fancy, just 20 head of cattle. I've been wondering how I'll manage them alone." "Are you offering me work, Mrs. Shaw?" Garrett asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Room and board and a fair wage," she replied. "At least until I decide what to do with the place. I can't pay much, but—" "I accept," Garrett said before she could finish. "Just like that?" Mrs. Miller asked suspiciously. "You don't even want to know the details?" Garrett's eyes never left Willow's face. "Sometimes a man knows when he's in the right place at the right time, madam." He glanced at the tiny bundle in Willow's arms. "Besides, I think Thomas here has taken a liking to me." As if on cue, the baby made a soft, cooing sound. "Well then," Willow said, feeling the first faint stirring of hope since John had fallen ill. "Welcome to Shaw Ranch, Mr. Blackwell." "Garrett," he corrected gently. "If we're going to be working together, you might as well use my given name." "Garrett," Willow repeated, testing the name on her tongue. Mrs. Miller cleared her throat pointedly. "The biscuits are getting cold and this little one needs to be fed. Mr. Blackwell, you're welcome to join us for breakfast, and then we can show you where you'll be staying." "I'd be much obliged," he replied with a smile that transformed his weathered face, making him look younger, almost boyish. As they entered the cabin, Willow felt a strange sense of relief mingled with guilt. John was barely cold in his grave, and yet here she was, inviting a stranger to live on their land, to help her continue what they had started together. But what choice did she have? A woman alone couldn't manage a ranch and a baby in this unforgiving territory. Besides, there was something about Garrett Blackwell that inspired trust. Perhaps it was the gentle way he'd held Thomas, or the respect in his eyes when he looked at her, not pity, as she'd seen in the gazes of townsfolk, but genuine admiration for her strength. Whatever it was, as Willow watched him hang his hat and coat by the door, she felt that perhaps, just perhaps, she and Thomas wouldn't have to face the future entirely alone after all. The first week passed in a blur of grief and practicality. Garrett proved himself immediately useful, rising before dawn to tend to the cattle, mending fences that had fallen into disrepair during John's illness, and chopping enough firewood to last well into summer. Willow found herself watching him from the cabin window as she went about her daily chores. There was something comforting about his presence on the property, his tall figure moving across the fields, the sound of his deep voice as he spoke soothingly to the horses, the way he always tipped his hat when he caught her looking. Mrs. Miller visited daily that first week, bringing food and helping with Thomas. She made no secret of her continued suspicion of Garrett. "I've asked around town about your Mr. Blackwell," she informed Willow one afternoon as they hung laundry together, Thomas sleeping in a basket nearby. "Nobody seems to know much about him." "He's not my Mr. Blackwell," Willow corrected, pinning one of Thomas's tiny shirts to the line. "He's just a hired hand." "A hired hand who looks at you like you're water in the desert," Mrs. Miller replied bluntly. "Don't pretend you haven't noticed." Heat rushed to Willow's cheeks. "That's ridiculous. He's being respectful of a widow, nothing more." Mrs. Miller snorted. "I'm old, child, not blind. The man's smitten, and what's more, you're not entirely indifferent yourself." "John's been gone barely 2 weeks," Willow said, her voice breaking. "How can you suggest such a thing?" The older woman's face softened. She reached out to squeeze Willow's hand. "I'm not suggesting anything improper, dear. Just observing that life has a way of continuing, whether we're ready or not, and John would want you to be safe and cared for." "Garrett is an employee," Willow insisted. "Nothing more." "If you say so," Mrs. Miller replied, clearly unconvinced. "But be careful with your heart, child. It's fragile right now, and a handsome cowboy with kind eyes could be mighty tempting to a young widow." Willow changed the subject, but Mrs. Miller's words lingered in her mind that evening as she prepared supper. Garrett came in from the fields, washing up at the basin by the door before joining her at the table. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by Thomas's occasional gurgles from his cradle nearby. Willow found herself studying Garrett when he wasn't looking, the strong lines of his face, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the careful gentleness of his large hands as he broke a piece of bread. "Is something wrong?" he asked, catching her gaze. "No," she replied quickly. "I was just thinking that you've been here a week now, and I hardly know anything about you." Garrett considered this as he sipped his coffee. "Not much to tell. I grew up in Kansas, youngest son of a farmer. Left home at 16 to find my own way. Been working cattle ranches ever since." "What brought you to Montana?" Willow asked. A shadow crossed his face. "Needed a change of scenery after the war." "You fought?" He nodded. "Union Army. Saw things no man should have to see." He fell silent for a moment, his eyes distant with memories. "After that, I couldn't settle anywhere for long. Just kept moving, taking work where I could find it." "And you have family back in Kansas, you said?" "Parents, 4 sisters, 2 brothers," he confirmed. "Write to them when I can, send money home when I have it." "You must miss them," Willow observed. Garrett smiled faintly. "Every day, but a man has to make his own way." He paused, studying her face. "What about you? How did you end up in Montana?" Willow sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of her plate. "John had big dreams. He wanted land of our own, a place to build something that would last. We were both tired of working for others back in Pennsylvania." "So you left everything behind and came west," Garrett said, admiration in his voice. "We were so full of hope," Willow whispered. "Even when I found out I was expecting Thomas, it only seemed to make our plans more perfect. A son to inherit what we built." Thomas began to fuss in his cradle, and Willow rose to attend to him. Garrett watched as she lifted the baby, cradling him against her shoulder. "You're doing well, you know," he said quietly. "Many would have given up by now, sold the place, gone back east." Willow looked around the cabin at the home she and John had built together, at the land outside that had been the foundation of their dreams. "I can't leave," she said simply. "Not yet. This place is all Thomas has left of his father." "I have to at least try to make it work." Garrett nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Well, as long as I'm here, you won't have to do it alone." Their gazes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of two souls who had each lost something vital, but were determined to keep moving forward. Thomas let out a wail, breaking the moment. Willow bounced him gently, but he continued to cry. "May I?" Garrett asked, rising from his chair. Willow hesitated only briefly before passing Thomas to him. Just as he had that first morning in the churchyard, Garrett held the baby with natural ease. Thomas's cries subsided almost immediately. "You have a gift," Willow observed. Garrett smiled down at the infant. "He's a good judge of character, that's all, aren't you?" "Little man?" Thomas grabbed at Garrett's finger, his tiny face serious as he studied the large man holding him. "I should probably turn in," Garrett said after a while, reluctantly handing Thomas back to Willow. "Gotta ride out to check the north pasture fence tomorrow. One of the steers broke through it yesterday." "Good night, then," Willow said. "And thank you, Garrett, for everything." He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "No need for thanks. We're in this together now." Then he was gone, crossing the yard to the small room attached to the stable where he'd been sleeping. Willow stood in the doorway, watching his retreating figure, Mrs. Miller's words echoing in her mind. She was still grieving John, would always love him. But she couldn't deny the comfort she found in Garrett's steady presence, or the way her heart had started to beat a little faster whenever he entered a room. "It's nothing," she told herself firmly. "Just gratitude and loneliness playing tricks on my heart." Thomas made a small sound against her shoulder, as if disagreeing. "You hush," she told him with a hint of a smile. "You're much too young to have opinions on such matters." As spring warmed into summer, the rhythm of their days took on a comfortable familiarity. Garrett worked from sunrise to sunset, tending the cattle, repairing the cabin, and gradually expanding the vegetable garden Willow had started. Willow cared for Thomas, cooked meals, and managed the household accounts, which were precarious at best. One evening in late June, after Thomas had been put to bed, Willow spread the account ledger on the kitchen table. The numbers were troubling. John had invested nearly everything they had in the cattle and land. What little savings remained wouldn't last through winter, especially with Garrett's wages to pay. She was still frowning at the figures when Garrett returned from the stable. "Bad news?" he asked, noting her expression. Willow sighed, pushing the ledger toward him. "See for yourself." Garrett studied the numbers, his brow furrowing. "We're short on cash." Willow noted with a sad smile. "You've started thinking of it as your problem, too." "Isn't it?" Garrett asked simply. Their eyes met, and Willow felt a flutter in her chest that had become increasingly familiar over the past months. "The cattle will fetch a good price come fall," Garrett continued, looking back at the ledger. "If we can make it until then." "That's the problem," Willow admitted. "At the current rate, we'll run out of money before August's end, and there's your wages to consider." "Forget my wages," Garrett said immediately. "Room and board is enough until we sell the cattle." "I can't ask you to work for free," Willow protested. "You're not asking. I'm offering." Garrett closed the ledger. "Besides, I've been thinking, if we're careful with our breeding program, this herd could double by next year. John chose good stock, strong bloodlines. We could have something special here." Willow said again, softer this time. Garrett met her gaze steadily. "I'm not going anywhere, Willow. Not unless you want me to." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken feelings that had been growing since that first meeting in the churchyard. "I don't want you to go," Willow admitted, barely above a whisper. Garrett reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of touching hers. "Then I'll stay." A cry from Thomas's cradle broke the moment. Willow rose automatically, but Garrett was already moving. "I'll get him," he said. "You've been on your feet all day." Willow watched as Garrett lifted Thomas, cradling him with practiced ease. The baby, now nearly 6 months old, immediately quieted, reaching up to grab at Garrett's beard. "Easy there, partner," Garrett chuckled. "That's attached." Something shifted in Willow's heart as she watched them together. Thomas needed a father, someone to teach him to ride, to hunt, to be a man in this wild country, and she needed... what? A partner? A friend? Something more? "He loves you," she said softly. Garrett looked up, his eyes meeting hers. The feeling's mutual. The words hung in the air, layered with meaning that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. That night, long after Garrett had returned to his room in the stable and Thomas was asleep, Willow lay awake, staring at the ceiling. John's memory was still there, a gentle presence in her heart, but it no longer dominated her every thought. Instead, she found herself thinking of Garrett, his quiet strength, his unfailing kindness, the way he treated Thomas as if the boy were his own son. "Is it wrong, John?" she whispered into the darkness. "Is it wrong to feel this way when you've been gone barely 4 months? No answer came, of course, but as she drifted toward sleep, Willow felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever was developing between her and Garrett, she would face it with the same courage that had brought her west in the first place. The following Sunday, Willow dressed Thomas in his best clothes for his christening at the small church in town. It was a milestone she and John had planned to celebrate together, and its arrival brought a fresh wave of grief. "Are you sure you want to do this today?" Garrett asked as he hitched the wagon. "We could wait another month or 2. Willow shook her head, adjusting Thomas's bonnet. "He's growing so fast. I don't want to wait any longer. Besides," she hesitated, "John would have wanted it done properly." Garrett nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Would you like me to stay with the wagon? I know it might seem odd to the townsfolk, me being there with you." "I'd like you to come," Willow said firmly. "You're part of Thomas's life now. You should be there." The church was fuller than usual, many people having come specifically for the christening. As Willow entered with Thomas in her arms and Garrett at her side, she felt the curious stares and heard the whispered comments. Mrs. Miller met them at the door, her face lighting up at the sight of Thomas in his christening gown. "He looks beautiful, Willow," she nodded to Garrett. "Mr. Blackwell." "Mrs. Miller," he replied with a respectful tip of his hat. The service proceeded smoothly until the moment of the christening itself. When Reverend Porter asked who would stand as godparents to Thomas John Shaw, Willow found herself saying, "Garrett Blackwell and Margaret Miller will stand for him." A murmur went through the congregation. Garrett's head turned sharply toward her, surprise evident in his expression. "Is that acceptable to you, Mr. Blackwell?" Reverend Porter asked, equally surprised. Garrett's eyes never left Willow's face as he answered, "It would be my honor, Reverend." The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur for Willow. She was acutely aware of Garrett standing beside her, his arm occasionally brushing hers as they moved through the ritual. When it came time for the godparents to make their promises to guide and protect the child, Garrett's voice rang out clear and firm, the sincerity in his tone causing tears to spring to Willow's eyes. Afterward, several church members approached to congratulate her and admire Thomas, but she could feel the undercurrent of gossip. A young widow with a handsome cowboy at her side was bound to cause talk, especially when that cowboy had just been named godfather to her child. As they prepared to leave, Reverend Porter pulled Willow aside. "Mrs. Shaw, a moment if I may." "Of course, Reverend," she replied, handing Thomas to Garrett, who stepped away to give them privacy. "Mrs. Shaw," the Reverend began hesitantly, "I don't wish to pry into your personal affairs, but there has been some talk in town." "About Mr. Blackwell," Willow finished for him. "Yes, it's not my place to judge, but appearances can be important, especially for a young widow. Having an unmarried man living on your property. He lives in the stable, Reverend, and his presence has been nothing but helpful." Willow's voice was steady despite the anger she felt rising. "I have a child to raise and a ranch to run. I can't do both alone." Of course, Reverend Porter backpedaled. I merely wanted to suggest that perhaps Mrs. Miller might consider staying with you for propriety's sake. Mrs. Miller has her own home and responsibilities, Willow replied, and I won't be driven by gossip to change arrangements that are working perfectly well for my son and me. I understand, the Reverend said, though his expression suggested otherwise. Please know that the church is here to support you, Mrs. Shaw, whatever you decide. Willow thanked him and joined Garrett, who was waiting by the wagon with Thomas. The baby had fallen asleep in his arms. Everything all right? Garrett asked, noting her flushed cheeks. Just the Reverend expressing concern about our living arrangement, Willow said as he helped her into the wagon. Apparently, we're the talk of the town. Garrett's jaw tightened. I could find somewhere else to stay if it would be better for you. No, Willow said firmly. I won't let small-minded gossip dictate how I live my life. You've been nothing but proper and helpful, and Thomas adores you. She paused, gathering her courage. And I've come to depend on you, Garrett, more than I probably should. He handed Thomas to her, then climbed up beside her on the wagon seat. As he took the reins, he said quietly, I've come to depend on you too, Willow. On both of you. The ride home was mostly silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the ranch, Garrett helped Willow down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist slightly longer than necessary. Thank you for asking me to be his godfather, he said, his voice husky with emotion. It means more than I can say. Willow looked up at him, at this man who had appeared in her life on the darkest of days and brought light back into it, bit by bit. You've been more of a father to him these past months than many men would be in a lifetime, she said softly. It seemed right. Garrett's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a breathless moment, Willow thought he might kiss her. Then Thomas stirred in her arms, and the moment passed. I should check on the cattle, Garrett said, stepping back. We had that calf looking poorly yesterday. Of course, Willow replied, trying to hide her disappointment. I'll have supper ready in an hour or so. As July turned to August, the tension between them grew, a sweet ache that neither seemed ready to acknowledge fully. They worked side by side during the days, their bodies occasionally brushing in the small cabin, each contact sending jolts of awareness through Willow. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset, while Thomas played on a blanket at their feet. It was during one such evening that Garrett finally broached the subject that had been hanging between them. I've been thinking, he began, his eyes on the horizon where the sun was sinking in a blaze of orange and pink. About what the Reverend said, about appearances. Willow's heart stuttered. I told you I don't care what people say. But I care, Garrett replied, turning to face her. I care about your reputation, about Thomas's future. I care about... He paused, seemingly gathering courage. About you, Willow. More than I've ever cared about anyone. She felt heat rise to her cheeks. Garrett, let me finish, he said gently. I know it hasn't been long since John passed. I know your heart is still healing. But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just friendship or responsibility. Willow's breath caught. What are you saying? Garrett reached out, taking her hand in his. I'm saying that I love you, Willow Shaw. I think I've loved you since that first morning in the churchyard when you trusted me enough to let me hold your son. And I love Thomas as if he were my own. I want to build a life with you both if you'll have me. Tears filled Willow's eyes. But what about the gossips? They'll say I didn't even wait a decent interval to remarry. Let them talk, Garrett said firmly. Life out here is too short and too hard to waste time worrying about what others think. The only opinions that matter are yours and mine. Willow looked down at their joined hands, at his strong, calloused fingers entwined with her smaller ones. I've been so afraid, she admitted. Afraid of what I feel for you, afraid it somehow diminishes what I had with John. Loving me doesn't mean loving him any less, Garrett said softly. Your heart is big enough for both. Yes, she whispered, looking up into his eyes. Yes, it is. Garrett's face broke into a smile that transformed his features, making him look young and almost boyish despite the beard and weathered skin. Is that a yes to my proposal as well? Willow laughed. suddenly light-hearted. "You haven't actually proposed yet." Garrett chuckled, then grew serious again. He slid from his chair to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "Willow Shaw, will you marry me? Let me be a father to Thomas, a partner to you for all the days we have?" "Yes," Willow said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you, Garrett Blackwell." He rose, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. His lips found hers in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened, years of loneliness and months of growing attraction culminating in a passion that left them both breathless. When they finally broke apart, Thomas was watching them with wide, curious eyes from his blanket. Garrett laughed, scooping the boy up into his arms. "Did you hear that, partner? Your mama's agreed to make us a proper family." Thomas giggled, reaching for Garrett's beard as he always did. Willow watched them, her heart so full it felt it might burst. In the midst of her greatest grief, she had found a new beginning, not a replacement for what she'd lost, but a different kind of happiness, equally precious. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch rather than the church, with only Mrs. Miller, Reverend Porter, and a few close friends in attendance. The Reverend had been surprisingly supportive once he understood the depth of their commitment to each other. "Love is God's greatest gift," he told them during the ceremony, "and finding it twice in one lifetime is a rare blessing indeed." Willow wore a simple blue dress rather than white, with wildflowers in her hair and Thomas in her arms. Garrett stood tall beside her in a new shirt and vest, his eyes never leaving her face as they spoke their vows. That night, after Thomas was asleep and they were finally alone, Garrett took Willow in his arms with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "I never thought I'd find a home," he murmured against her hair. "Been wandering so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere." "And now?" Willow asked, looking up at him. "Now I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he replied, lowering his mouth to hers. As summer faded into fall, the ranch thrived under their combined efforts. The cattle were fat and healthy, promising a good price at market. The garden had yielded a bountiful harvest that Willow preserved for winter. Thomas grew stronger daily, now crawling everywhere and pulling himself up to stand, his happy babbling filling the cabin with joy. One crisp October morning, Garrett rode out early to round up the cattle for the drive to market. It was a critical moment for their future. The sale would determine whether they could expand the herd next spring and finally put the ranch on solid financial footing. Willow spent the day nervously cleaning and preparing a special dinner to celebrate when Garrett returned. Thomas seemed to sense her anxiety, fussing more than usual and refusing to nap. "Your papa will be home soon," she told him as she bounced him on her hip, looking out the window for what felt like the 100th time. "And then we'll know if we can buy those new heifers he's been talking about." As the afternoon stretched into evening with no sign of Garrett, Willow's anxiety grew. The cattle market was in Helena, a good half-day's ride each way, but he should have been back by now. When darkness fell and still he hadn't returned, real fear set in. 1,000 terrible scenarios played through her mind: a riding accident, cattle thieves, a sudden illness. She kept Thomas up well past his bedtime, unwilling to sleep until Garrett was safely home. Finally, near midnight, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded through her as she rushed to the door, Thomas in her arms. Garrett dismounted slowly, his movements stiff with fatigue, but when he looked up and saw her waiting, his face split into a wide grin. "We did it, Willow," he called, striding toward her. "Got top dollar for every head, and there's more." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small leather pouch. "The banker in Helena was so impressed with our stock. He's offered us a loan to double the herd come spring." Willow's eyes widened. "A loan? Really?" "Really," Garrett confirmed, sweeping her and Thomas into his arms. "Shaw Ranch is officially on the map. We'll be the premier cattle operation in the territory within 5 years if things keep going this way." Willow laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "I was so worried when you were late." "Got held up talking terms with the banker," Garrett explained, leading her inside. "Then decided to ride straight through rather than camp. Didn't want you worrying." He kissed her forehead. Sorry about that. You're home now, Willow said. That's all that matters. As she served the dinner she'd kept warm for him, Willow watched Garrett with Thomas. The baby was fighting sleep, determined not to miss anything despite the late hour. Someone's stubborn, Garrett observed with a chuckle. Wonder where he gets that from. His father, obviously, Willow replied, then paused, realizing the ambiguity in her statement. Garrett seemed to understand what she was thinking. Both of them, he said softly. John's blood runs in his veins, but I hope he picks up a thing or two from me as well. He already has, Willow assured him. The way he watches everything so carefully, that's all you. And that serious little frown when he's concentrating, pure Garrett Blackwell. Garrett looked pleased. You think so? I know so, Willow said. She hesitated, then added, I've been thinking. When he's older, we should make sure he knows about John, about the man who gave him life, who dreamed of this ranch first. Of course we will, Garrett agreed immediately. I'd never want to take that from him. John will always be part of who Thomas is. He reached across the table to take her hand. Just as he'll always be part of who you are. And I wouldn't change that, not for anything. Willow squeezed his hand, overwhelmed by the generosity of spirit in the man she'd married. I love you, Garrett, more than I ever thought possible. And I love you, Mrs. Blackwell, he replied, using the name she'd taken, but that still sometimes felt new on her ears. You and this little man are my whole world. As winter blanketed the ranch in snow, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The loan from the Helena Bank allowed them to make improvements to the cabin, adding a proper bedroom for Thomas and reinforcing the walls against the bitter Montana cold. Garrett worked tirelessly, even in the worst weather, ensuring the cattle were fed and sheltered. Christmas brought new joy as Thomas, now nearly a year old, delighted in the simple presents they exchanged and the colorful decorations Willow hung around the cabin. Garrett carved a small wooden horse for Thomas, who clutched it constantly, even in sleep. Next year he'll be old enough to really understand, Garrett said as they sat by the fire on Christmas night, Thomas asleep on his chest. Next year we might have another little one to celebrate with, Willow replied softly. Garrett's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Willow, are you saying? She nodded, her hand moving to her still flat stomach. I suspected for a few weeks, now I'm sure. Garrett carefully laid Thomas in his cradle, then returned to pull Willow into his arms. A baby, he whispered, awe in his voice. Our baby. Our baby, Willow confirmed, tears of joy in her eyes. Due in summer, I think. Garrett dropped to his knees before her, pressing his ear to her stomach as if he might already hear the tiny heartbeat within. Hello in there, he said softly. I'm your pa, and I can't wait to meet you. Willow ran her fingers through his hair, her heart overflowing with love for this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly and changed everything. I never thought I could be this happy again, she admitted. After John died, it felt like all the light had gone out of the world. Garrett looked up at her. And now I have more light than I ever dreamed possible, she replied. You gave that to me, Garrett. You and Thomas. Spring brought renewal to the land and anticipation to the Blackwell household. Willow's belly grew round with new life, while Thomas took his first proper steps, toddling across the cabin floor to Garrett's waiting arms. The cattle herd expanded with the birth of new calves, and Garrett hired 2 young cowboys to help with the increased workload. Shaw Ranch was becoming exactly what John had dreamed it could be, though perhaps in ways he couldn't have imagined. On a warm morning in early June, almost exactly 1 year after Garrett had first appeared in their lives, Willow felt the first pains that signaled their baby was coming. Mrs. Miller was summoned from town, and Garrett paced anxiously outside the cabin while Thomas watched with solemn curiosity from the porch swing. The labor was long but uncomplicated. As the sun was setting, Willow gave birth to a daughter with a shock of dark hair and her father's stormy eyes. She's perfect, Garrett whispered when Mrs. Miller finally allowed him into the bedroom. He sat gingerly on the edge of the bed, cradling his newborn daughter with the same care he'd shown Thomas on that first morning in the churchyard. What shall we call her? Willow watched them, exhausted but deeply content. I was thinking we might name her Hope, she said, because that's what she represents for us, hope for the future, for the life we're building together. Hope, Garrett repeated, testing the name. Hope Blackwell. It's perfect. He leaned down to kiss Willow's forehead. Thank you for giving me a family, for making me a father twice over. Thank you for finding us that day, Willow replied. For stopping when you heard a baby cry in the churchyard at dawn. Garrett smiled at the memory. Best decision I ever made, asking to hold him a while. As if on cue, the door creaked open and Thomas appeared, escorted by Mrs. Miller. His eyes widened at the sight of the tiny bundle in Garrett's arms. Come meet your sister, Thomas, Willow called softly. Garrett lifted the boy onto the bed, helping him sit beside Willow. This is Hope, he explained. She's very new, so we need to be gentle with her. Thomas reached out a cautious finger to touch the baby's hand. Hope's tiny fingers immediately curled around her brother's, creating a connection that brought tears to Willow's eyes. Family, Thomas said clearly, one of the few words he had mastered. That's right, son, Garrett confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. We're a family. Mrs. Miller discreetly wiped her eyes. I'll leave you folks be for a bit, she said. Call if you need anything. When she had gone, Garrett shifted to sit beside Willow on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, the other cradling Hope. Thomas snuggled between them, his head resting against Willow's side. If someone had told me 2 years ago that I'd be sitting here with a wife, a son, and a newborn daughter, I'd have said they were crazy, Garrett mused. Back then I couldn't see past the next horizon, the next job. And now? Willow asked, echoing the question she had asked on their wedding night. Now I can't imagine being anywhere but here, he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. This is home, Willow. You, Thomas, little Hope here, you're my home, my heart, my everything. As twilight deepened into night, the small family remained together, bound by love that had begun in grief, but blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the grass, carrying the promise of tomorrow and all the days to come. 5 years later, Willow stood in the doorway of their expanded home, watching as Garrett taught 6-year-old Thomas to rope a calf in the corral. Hope, now a spirited 4-year-old with her father's determination, was perched on the fence, cheering her brother on. Beside Willow, 3-year-old John Garrett Blackwell tugged at her skirt, eager to join his siblings. Not yet, little one, she told him, smoothing his unruly hair. You're still too small for roping lessons. Shaw Ranch had prospered beyond their wildest dreams. The small herd that John Shaw had started had grown tenfold under Garrett's careful management. The original cabin was now just the kitchen of a sprawling ranch house that boasted 4 bedrooms, a proper parlor, and even a small library where Willow taught the children their letters. Life wasn't always easy. Montana winters were still brutal, cattle prices fluctuated, and there had been a frightening summer 2 years back when both Thomas and Hope had fallen ill with fever. But through it all, the love between Willow and Garrett had only deepened, strengthened by each challenge they faced together. As Willow watched her family, her hand instinctively moved to her belly, where a 4th child was just beginning to make its presence known. She hadn't told Garrett yet, wanting to be sure before sharing the news. "Mama, look!" Thomas called excitedly as his small lasso settled around the calf's neck. "I did it! Well done!" Willow called back, her heart swelling with pride. Garrett gave Thomas an approving nod, then lifted Hope down from the fence. Catching sight of Willow and little John in the doorway, he said something to the children that made them laugh before striding toward the house. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, sweeping John up in one arm while using the other to pull Willow close for a kiss. "And how are you feeling today? Still under the weather?" Willow smiled up at him. Her nausea had been what finally convinced her she was expecting again. "Actually, I'm feeling much better. And I think I know why I've been so tired lately." Garrett's eyes widened, understanding dawning immediately. "Willow, are we?" She nodded, unable to contain her joy. "Come fall, there'll be another Blackwell at the table." "Another baby," Garrett breathed, his face lighting up with the same wonder it had shown at the news of Hope's impending arrival. He set John down gently. "Run along to your brother and sister for a minute, son. Mama and I need to talk." Once John had toddled off toward Thomas and Hope, Garrett pulled Willow into a proper embrace. "I'm the luckiest man alive," he murmured against her hair. "And I'm the luckiest woman," Willow replied. "To think that if you hadn't been passing by that churchyard that day—" "I believe we were meant to find each other," Garrett said seriously. "Call it fate, call it God's plan, whatever it was. I'm grateful for it every day." "As am I," Willow agreed, "though I still miss John sometimes." "Of course you do," Garrett said, no trace of jealousy in his voice. "He'll always be part of our family's story. Without him, there would be no Thomas, no ranch, no us." Willow leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Do you ever think about how strange life is? How one moment can change everything?" "I think about it every time I look at you and our children," Garrett replied. "Every time I remember that morning when a baby cried in the churchyard at dawn, and a lonely cowboy said, 'Let me hold him a while.'" "The beginning of our story," Willow said softly. "But nowhere near the end," Garrett promised, placing his hand over hers on her stomach. "We've got many chapters yet to write, Mrs. Blackwell. Many happy years ahead." As the Montana sun shone down on Shaw Ranch, painting the land in gold and promise, Willow knew with absolute certainty that he was right. Their story, born in grief but nurtured in love, would continue to unfold in ways they couldn't yet imagine. And whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, two hearts that had found each other against all odds, creating a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Hope called to them from the corral, eager to show off her own attempt at roping. Hand in hand, Willow and Garrett walked toward their children, toward their future, each step a testament to the healing power of love and the endless possibilities that come when you open your heart to begin again.